I want to make sure we get our other critics in, Guilherme, if you wouldn't mind. So I'm going to move on and introduce Professor Anna Bergquist. Anna's a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University, also is a visiting fellow at St. Catherine's College with the Collaborating Centre, and also faculty on the International Meta Masters on Phenomenology and Values-Based Clinical Care. Anna, we look forward to your commentary.
Thank you very much, Ashok, for that generous presentation. What I want to do is to some extent follow the cue of Professor Sass in concentrating really on the second part, where certain diagnostic analyses that focus in specifically on the dialectical analysis kind of is what drives the analysis of substance misuse. So I will not focus directly on substance misuse. I will focus on specific presentation. So just bear with me 1 second here. Okay, so partly due to Professor Messas' very, I would say, sensitive and highly innovative take on clinical presentations, I will focus my commentary mainly on the both analysis of temporal, but specifically the dialectical self-other manifestation in the borderline presentation. And I will do so partly because it brings out, I think, certain innovations of the approach that was touched upon earlier in relation to the benefit of not taking a stance on questions about what is part of an analysis as opposed to a function. Okay, so just as an overview, I will focus specifically on fragmentation in the borderline personality disorder or presentation, as the presentation is here. I want to jump straight in here on the characterization of a certain type of vulnerability, both to unstable temporality, but also a variety of the other dimensions that are part of the wider framework for analyzing the self-other polarizations. So the central vulnerability here that is identified is one of discontinuity, discontinuity of the present in relation to retention as a form of fragmentation. And we see also that in relation to the presence of the other and so forth. But I will focus here on this type of discontinuity as a starting point. So the example that Professor Messas gives in section 3.1.2 is as follows. My thing of always thinking about being someone else in the future tortures me. My instability bothers me. I can't be present. I'm always in the future wanting to be someone else, to have other friends beyond my reality. It's like I think so much about others that I don't know what I want. And in the same section, another more severe form of temporal discontinuity mentioned is seen as post-traumatic dissociation. Okay, so the reason why I've focused on this as a starting point here is that it brings out the underlying relational dimension of that we as a key for understanding impulsivity, specifically in understanding borderline impulsivity. And here we can think of this as the result, and I quote, the result of the terrible instability that dominates the borderline impulsivity existence. And I will quote here at length because I think this paragraph is rather telling. The borderline person's vulnerability means that they are led by a psychologically painful stimulus to take thoughtless acts that are harmful to themselves and to others. This occurs because the reaction to a stimulus suddenly transforms the dialectical relations among the dimensions of temporality, causing the person to abandon their usual kind of reaction. Thus, for example, a marital argument may lead a borderline person to attempt suicide, even if the previous psychological state is apparently stable. The person loses all perspective of pretension that was discussed earlier in relation to the possible deprivation of the total presence of the other person, suddenly identifying life as a lack of prospects, loneliness, and pain. When faced with this annulment of the possibility of existence, suicide presents itself as an alluring option. So what I find very interesting here is, and this is just one example of one of the many dialectical relations that may be implied here in the different types of fragmentations that there are. But what we have here is this always present, implicit, other involving, be it in terms of future directness of time or in terms of proximity, that in some sense is what is underlying the fragmentation in question. And I think that's interesting because it takes us straight into questions about agency and specifically how to, as it were, reconcile dissociative and indeed other types of fragmentation types of experiences and the wider question of self-knowledge. So as a bit of wider context here, so dissociation and I guess fragmentation more generally, as a clinical example where the normal sense of self is disrupted, has always been of special interest to philosophers investigating agentic first-person thinking and also emotional ownership of thought. And there is a default assumption in philosophy that there is a constitutive link between awareness of an action and a sense of agency. You can get around that with the minimal self and so on, but that's almost axiomatic. Now, I mean, contrast that research on personality in psychology, where we give a psychological account of the action independently of the further psychological questions about ownership. Yeah, so for instance, and here's a telling example of a description of the de facto problem for the person in terms of emotional distress. And I quote this from Bradley and Weston's work quite some time ago. The experience of self as agentic is often disrupted in borderline personality by a pattern in which impulses are acted upon so immediately that the self is not experienced as the author of the act. And I mention this partly because it's from these types of observations about dissociative disruptions in BPD that theorists sometimes conclude that the individual with borderline is incapable of regarding themselves as the initiator of their experiences. And that in itself has wider consequences for stigma, specifically in relation to this condition. So just to illustrate, here is a typical case. This is a fictional case from Hannah Pickard, where this type of philosophical view, I think, is captured quite well. So I quote from Professor Pickard's work as follows. Within Martha's narrative of her life history, overdoses were things that happened. They were the final event in a coherent and well-ordered sequence of events that made explanatory sense. But they were not things she did. For instance, when asked in group to describe the lead up to one overdoses, Martha eloquently explained how, feeling overwhelmed and like she could bear life no longer, she got into a car and went to buy alcohol and tablets before driving to a secluded place, only to conclude, and then there was an overdose. When the group questioned her about why she did not say that she then took an overdose, she became defensive and distressed and rushed out of the group. When she returned, she initially refused to speak to the group about why she left. But when pressed, reported that early childhood feelings of being the black sheep in the family had been triggered by the group's questioning, and that she had been scared of securing flashbacks as a result. So that's quite a typical way that the almost axiomatic correlation between awareness and ownership is captured in the philosophical issue. Now, I now want to suggest that one of the interesting features of Professor Messas' book here is that it opens up a way of adding more nuance to that type of presentation. And it takes us specifically to the relationship between ownership and self-prescription in dialectical terms. Just to suggest here that the default story about how persons with borderlines understand themselves, I want to contrast the case that I just gave you with a real self-reported experience from a typical self-help forum. And this is taken from a discussion that's been on there for a few years in the online, and you have the reference at the bottom. So this is a real self-report. And I quote, I keep reading from nons, so here, non-borderliners, that sorry, my cat just walked on the keyboard. That BPDs are completely incapable of any introspection. I do not agree with this. I know that I certainly have times of introspection, and I am actually a fairly introspective person, constantly analysing myself and my behaviour. I also deny a lot of aspects of myself, but at least I am aware that there are things that I am in denial about, right? I don't know, I suspected BPD long before being diagnosed. Maybe all the reading I have done about the condition has given me better introspection. But I feel like I have always been fairly introspective. The problem for me isn't recognizing the behavior when I'm fine. It's being able to change it once I am in those emotions. I am aware, I just feel completely out of control of my actions. It's like I can still hear the rational voice, but that rational voice has zero control for me. Does anyone feel this way? How introspective are you? Do you think real introspection is possible for BPD? Okay, so I'm just going to suggest here that if we just take this report on the evidence at face value, the subject in question shows enhanced and not diminished introspection from being diagnosed with BPD. So as just described, even though they're not acting on their sense of self in the dissonant situation as described, she could still hear the rational voice relating to the narrative theme of agency. So in my own work, I argue that the problem here, at least, well, the problem for the person is not lack of a gentle self-awareness as such, but rather the practical problem of disruption between your awareness as yourself and the corresponding non-agential behavior. And I've also argued in some of my work that the disown bits of behavior that are of our practical concern as be impulsive or out of control, they do not as such reveal a breakdown or incapacity of self-attribution in the relevant dissonance scenarios. In other words, the person do not seem to have any doubt in their own mind on which disowned impulses act. In fact, if anything, they appear precisely out of character from the person in question. If anything, again, taking the report at face value, it is precisely the sharpness of the boundary between your sense of self and the disowned non-agential behavior that constitutes the very symptom of impulsive behavior, characteristic of identity disturbance that is commonly singled out as a core difficulty in understanding mental and emotional distress. So that's just what my own view on this amounts to. But what I want to concentrate on what follows is that I think Professor Messas' work is really, really fantastic in addressing the new theoretical challenge of explaining integration of practical agency in, as we're holding hope for patients in recovery, and indeed the clinical significance of the personal self in dissonance cases more generally. So I now want to turn to what Professor Messas has got to say about impulsivity. So first of all, we have the suggestion that we're dealing here, this is yet another result of the terrible dialectical temporal self-other hypersufficiency that dominates the very existence of impulsivity in question. So here is just one of the dimensions, namely temporality, which is described as follows, and I quote, "The historical self longs for eternity, time filled by the other person's total presence, and the importance that the borderline historical self gives to these experiences of plenitude itself is subsequent." So on the analysis, impulsivity occurs because the reaction to a stimulus suddenly transform the dialectical relations among the dimensions of temporality, just to mention one dimension, causing the person to abandon their usual kind of reaction. I'll read on a bit further. So this is on page 78. So for example, so that takes us back to where we started, where you might simply just forget your situatedness. Okay, so there is here, I think, what's useful with this type of orientation is that we have a wider structural background whereby the self-other analyses are pointed up as features against which our non-pathological or indeed our ordinary familiarity of being in the world operates. And I find what's particularly useful of paying attention to the kind of disruptions to the self-other dimensions here. It makes visible that background relational orientation that is there in ordinary life, such that it's only really where that type of background plays up as being disrupted that we are dealing with a problem here. And I think that's another feature of the distinctly dialectical version of phenomenology that Messas is championing here. It brings out, I was reminded here of Schultz's notion of the social relationship. So this is Schultz writing in the late 1960s of social cognition in, as it were, non-pathological cases, where our ordinary existence is one of other orientation. And I think what's useful with the analysis in question here is that if we move beyond anthropological analysis that takes place in the book to the structural analysis, there is a further question as to whether or not that type of structural feature is one that marks out that as a structural condition in relation to this other orientation. So that was one question that I have. But just to close up here. So one suggestion here, and I'm thinking here in relation to understanding fragmentation against the wider context of these social we relations in dialectical terms. So one way forward here would perhaps use a phenomenological distinction between a pre-reflexive orientation on the one hand and propositional contents in analyzing and indeed interpreting phenomena, to develop Marcel's notion of the long-term sense of agency as a background, as a type of pre-reflexive orientation or immersion, such that the occurrent stage of agency wouldn't have its phenomenology without the long-term background. And I think that's important when it for clinical context, when it comes to relating to non-standard ways of being in the world, because it can also be understood as a project in empathetic understanding and also accountability. Okay, so to close up then, if we then have this idea of self-other dialectics as something that always inform our life worlds, and where various pathologies can, in one way or the other, be analyzed in terms of disruptions to those types of background structure. There is also, I think, a way of engaging with therapeutically in holding hope for the other, in as much as even when we have breakdowns, both in relating to your own sense of future, but also in your personal relationships, you can still think of those types of something that is nonetheless there, even when your practical agency have ended up in.
Anna, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this, because I'm really worried about shortchanging our next speaker. So if you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen, please.
Yes.
And then thank you so much for that. As I said in the chat, we're going to move straight on to our final speaker, and then have the commentaries both for your critique and his together, if that's all right. So